If you're doing seed production, you really want to be really good at growing the thing that you're growing, as if you were a really good market grower. So don't grow onions or any other seed crop for a seed if you're not already.
Welcome to episode 22 of the Seed Farmer Podcast. I'm Dan Brisebois, seed grower at Turnasol Cooperative Farm and spreadsheet and crop planning enthusiast. I'm also author of the upcoming book, The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seeds. We're actually a week out from the official release date of this book, and you can pre-order your book now if you want, from no-till growers and other places where fine books are sold. With the Seed Farmer Podcast, I want you to get inspired to go out and grow some seed on your farm. Heron Breen is this episode's guest. Heron grows seed on 6 acres at Fruits of Our Labors in St. Albans, Maine. In this episode, Heron and I discuss the nature of seed work as a plant-based meditation that encompasses sculpture, art, science, and quantum physics, and the generational connection that seed provides across time and space. And then we pivot into talking about how to space seed crops and the reasons and importance of broader spacing before delving into what words like heirloom and open pollinated seeds really mean. In the deep dive, we talk about growing onions and leeks for seed. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Before we start the show, let's get a word from the Seed Farmer show sponsors.
Hello, everyone. This is Owen Taylor.
And this is Chris Bolden Newsom of True Love Seeds. We are farmers who run a seed company to preserve our ancestral plant relatives from all over the world and share our seeds with gardeners and farmers seeking out their beloved tastes of home.
We also have a podcast we think you will enjoy. It's called Seeds and Their People. We interview growers about the plants that keep their culture thriving.
Tune in wherever you listen to podcasts and at trueloveseeds.com.
All right, everyone, important public service announcement. I know some of you are already making plans for how you'll spend the winter, ordering tools, researching seeds, projecting crops. It's also a great time to gather with our farmers to share knowledge and skills. This February, join thousands of farmers like you from across the U.S. for 3 days of community building and farmer-led learning at the 36th Annual Marble Seed Organic Farming Conference in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Find out more and register at marbleseed.org/conference. All right, back to the show. Hello, Heron. Welcome to the Seed Farmer Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dan.
So I've known you for a while, but we're also on a couple email listservs together. Recently, you've had a lot of longer replies, and I've just really enjoyed reading them. And I thought, I want to have a conversation with you in real time. And so that's why I invited you on here.
Well, I have to kind of hold, I'm always like reading things and saying, maybe I should respond to this. But then I'm like, that would take me like 3 hours to write that email. So you're thankfully there's only the tip of the iceberg of my megalomania that exposes itself on the listservs. But there's a lot of good questions that we all ask, and we're all trying to figure it out.
Well, let's flip that iceberg and get the big part up right now.
Sure.
Why don't we just jump in and talk about, and you could tell us about how you got into seed. What is your seed story?
Well, a seed story is I guess sort of this quick version, if there is one, is that I grew up on a kind of hippie homesteading farm. We weren't one of those hippie homesteaders that had a bunch of money. That was kind of the whoops, that was a bad idea. Should have maybe had more money I didn't really know we were exactly that we were hippies or that we were homesteading. Most of that poverty didn't really feel like choice, and I don't think it really was. So I grew up in a pretty simple household. We didn't have like a flush toilet or blah blah blah. We we did not have running hot water. We had to heat up all the hot water that we used. We did have running water, but not running hot water. And so that was kind of like we had our own garden. And that was a big part of our lives, and kind of part of my enforced servitude was to work in the garden, and I hated it. Couldn't wait to go play in the woods or go over to my best friend's dairy farm and play at his farm. So I never really had the perspective that I was going to end up doing plant work, and I did work on a farm through high school because I knew something about vegetables because I'd worked with my parents. And that kind of experience ended up being in my early 20s. I got a autoimmune disorder came to light and was very crippling. I was like disabled for a couple of years. Was in the hospital for quite a bit and in and out, and was very skinny and could not do much. And that led me to being very bored. People who have chronic illnesses will probably tell you that boredom, or just like it's kind of miserable because you can't really do anything. You're kind of trapped within the limitations of your body. So I had a friend who had a farm, and or I knew of a friend who had a farm, and I asked him if I could come over and just do some work for just like, even if it was just like an hour, just to be outside, just have a place to be, and then he wouldn't have to pay me, and if I could just come over and have something to do. So that it started that way because I just wanted to have something to do. And I would go over and just like whenever I ran out of steam, I would check out. And that could be an hour, it could be 5 hours, but it could be a day a week, could be a couple days a week. Eventually, I realized that was a pretty good environment for me to recover in and gain my physical strength through. And there's a lot of challenges and tribulations when you're ill, mostly financial, but also personal, because I was in my early 20s, and all your friends are off doing early 20s things, and you're kind of stuck in a pretty serious illness, and it's hard. And I was out doing some work, and I was just kind of working through all my thoughts. And at the end of the day, I was like, geez, I came to the farm kind of miserable, but I left the farm in a pretty good headspace. And I realized it was like an epiphany of, working with plants. And, I'd had a connection with plants through forests, nature growing up, just where I live, and realized that this work, this interface between people and plants and what plants were offering and people was not a really talked about thing in our society, and it had both a spiritual and a personal connection for me. That was a moment where I said, geez, I think I should start working with plants more seriously. At that point, I had kind of already started working part-time at Fedco Seeds seasonally. And I kind of leaned into that, I guess, as the young folks say, and made that kind of something I was doing and found my way through it. There's a lot of, failures or, paths that lead nowhere or they lead somewhere and you learn something. But with Fedco, it was a great experience to work at a retail seed company, mail order retail seed company, very flexible, creative atmosphere with some really great folks who became, kind of real mentors or at least sort of uncles and aunts in a lot of ways to me as I grew up, because I basically grew up there. I ended up working there for 23 years. So from the time I was 22, I want to say, till just a few years ago. So I grew up there, basically, which was bad for them, good for me. And that story of there was a point in that work where selling something has limitations, which is there's only so many things that you can have, the bandwidth for the customer, or how, what can sell, what won't sell. And there's just decisions that get made because that's what selling something kind of creates. And I realized there was work that I wanted to do that the seed company was, rightfully saying, hey, that's just not what we do or what we're interested in. And I said, well, I have to have a little bit of separation between church and state. And so, Fedco being state and my own kind of path being what I believed in, which was my version of church. So this was in my late 20s, and I kind of looked around for some land to lease or rent or something, because I was in no financial position to own or buy anything, and really still am not really in that position. And, I say to people about your farm is that, like whatever you go into your farming thinking in your head what a farm looks like, that may be a great goal. It may also be something that constrains you. So if you go into thinking that a farm is a white farmhouse and a big barn and all kinds of facilities and equipment, you're going to have to carry that debt because that's what you're sort of proving to yourself that equals a farm. So for me, proving to myself what equaled a farm was I just wanted to work in the dirt. And I didn't have a lot of that. I should be like this. And I just knew that I started off thinking that I was selling vegetables. I sold vegetables kind of wholesale for a while, off and on, but integrated seed work into that. And the seed work part of it was just really when I was at my kind of some of my lowest points in my health. I had always wanted to travel the world, and which really hasn't happened and probably won't happen. But I was really food and cooking was really interesting. It had always been interesting to me. And as a kid, I just watched every cooking show I could possibly watch on the public television. Um, and I always I love food and I wanted to travel all these different places. And I just realized I wasn't going to travel to all these different places. So I had to figure out how I was going to bring those places to me. And part of that was okay, I'll grow food from those places in my home garden, from Italy or what have you. And then I kind of stumbled upon the fact that some of this stuff was very rare, or that there was this thing called seed saving. And that was interesting to me. And then I kind of realized there was these things that were older and that were rare and that maybe needed some folks to do some seed saving with. And that was kind of an epiphany, my first year of saving seed from a squash. And, it was kind of mind blowing. And I realized that was the way that I could bring the food to me, but also realized that it was a version of time travel, where if you grew a squash that somebody had eaten 200 years ago, you were actually sensorily participating in the same sensory experience that they had, which is a real commonality in terms of consciousness. If you're eating something that somebody else ate, and that those same receptors fire, even when I have different context, that's a really interesting space. So for me, this seed work sort of started there and involved in my farm. I really didn't call it my farm. I rented about 6 or 8 acres, and it still is my primary kind of site. And that was I called it my laboratory. I didn't really mean it like I was a scientist, but more like I needed to experiment and kind of make some failures, but also try to find different ways to do this work. And whether that's learning how to seed save or learning how to do whatever it was, because there's a lot of stuff that we get taught or you can read about, but then you have to do it. And so that led me to a point where I was really doing seed work. I was working kind of Fedco full time, or working Fedco between 40 and 80 hours a week. And then I was kind of farming 40 to 80 hours a week. And there's a point
Sounds like
where
a nice balanced life.
it was very balanced, and trying to be a dad and trying to be a person. And there's a point there where I was, said, my work is really getting in the way of my farm or whatever. And I sort of decided, hey, maybe I should, decide to graduate from Fedco and kind of focus on my own thing full time. And so that's kind of what I've been doing for the last couple of years, trying to do this work 100% full time, or at least kind of 80-20 rather than 50-50.
Well, thanks for that walkthrough. I love how you describe the process of saving seeds as traveling through space and through time, and that getting in connection. Just the way you phrased it, I definitely relate to that, and so I really like hearing that coming from you, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, that generationality, we I think a lot of folks have read about that work or heard. Our tribal and indigenous and peasant seed keepers speak of that generational connection that seeds and plants and food and traditions create. America is a weird place where we're basically told to abandon all traditions, is at the doorstep, pretty much, and embrace whatever it is that is the quote American way, which is mostly going to work. Becoming part of the, kind of whatever the capitalist model is. So that traditional element has really is either willfully or kind of time isn't afforded for it. in the culture in America. So a lot of the European folks, myself included, that are, the majority of America, don't really have traditions, and thus are kind of divorced from their seed and divorced from their food in many ways. So it turns out that while we might be the dominant culture, and we actually don't have a culture. And so a lot of folks are that's their touchstone for a lot of their work with food is remembering and discovering their own cultural traditions. And seed is a great way to discover those traditions and embrace your own individual family traditions or your regional traditions of where you happen to have been settled, or your family, or where you grew up. So it's a very place-based meditation. Seed work is to me, is a embracing of a lot of different, well, this is how it works for me. I'm sure other people can say it. But for me, it's an embracement of art, sculpture, science, quantum physics, a lot of different kind of elements that a person gets to or can apply. Some folks are, really into machinery and are whizzes at that. I am not going to claim to be that person. I can figure things out, but I'm not pretending to be a gearhead. For me, it's mostly kind of the selection, stewardship kind of interface point between plants and humans. That is kind of the place that I try to spend most of my time in, successfully or not. But I just think seed work, but farming as a whole, seed work is a subset of farming, has a marriage intergenerational context, and also has the ability to really consume a lot of a person's sensory capacity and logic capacity, and in a good way. So people are always like, oh, did you watch this show on, we'll stream this ball? I'm like, I don't have time for that. I'm trying to figure out how to grow radish seed.
Yeah.
So those are kind of like, in some ways, like I'm not trying to escape from the world. In some ways, I feel like the world itself might be trying to escape from me. Or from what we're doing, because this work is kind of like the baseline for humanity is eating, and seed is kind of the baseline for food and farming. So this work is really, again, like kind of a meditation on like what is humanity. A lot of people could say it's water, it's air, it's a lot of other things, but one of those things is food. And in our little Santa Claus workshops that we all are working on seeds in, it's basically, that's like kind of the thing that we're into.
Oh, I like that. I like how you bring that tradition in, and I don't know if this is what you're saying, but what I'm hearing is that though we're separated from these traditions, just the process of growing a crop and then trying to take the seeds out puts us back into the context of what our ancestors, immediate and much further back, had to deal with. So we have to either recreate or refine those techniques to do it. And that's kind of what I'm hearing. Just, it makes you have to go into your traditions.
If you're present with it, which I can't say that we always are, or that I am with it, I say this I say the word quantum, I mean that you are in two places at once, or maybe many places at once. You're where that crop was grown before, and also all the people that touched that crop and the climate that crop was in, and then also where you are now and where you're going. And it's not a seed is a transitory moment. So if you so this fruits of our labor, which is the name of the sort of entity, I wouldn't really call it a business, that I kind of have created for myself to do a business under. It comes from the word fool, so it's an acronym. And the fool part is from the tarot card, the Fool, where there is a person, non-gendered, walking and stepping off a cliff. And they have a little bag over their shoulder, and there's a little sack of things like the traveler. And so one foot is off the cliff and one foot is on the cliff, and they're kind of joyfully kind of stepping off the cliff. And it kind of, there's a letter that goes along with it, a Hebrew aleph, letter that basically means unformed consciousness. And is the kind of metaphor for a seed. So what it means is that the seed is basically like a sleeping baby. a baby unborn whose consciousness is still waiting to be formed. And so there's, just to be left, that particular card, a lot of people don't know that it's actually an inverted representation for the constellation Orion. And so in some of the cards, so the dog is actually Canis Major. And in some of the pictures of the card, there's a goat, which is actually, there's a goat that's above the person that people call Orion. So, and there's a lot of stuff in that for me, just this concept of the unformed consciousness, and that seed is this, a lot of people think of seeds as not finished or something. And actually seeds are fully finished plants. They're ready to go. There's not a final, they really are a baby waiting to be born. There's not formation occurring. Once you plant those seeds, it's ready to pop. So I think just thinking about that to me is that transitory. And those seeds are kind of bringing you can say it's the DNA, and DNA is basically messenger DNA. They're bringing the information that they learned in previous generations to the moment that you plant them. So they're bringing this message from the past. So you can choose to understand the present, just like we look at a forest and we say, there's the trees. Well, the forest tells us basically what has transpired in that land for the last, could be centuries if we really know how to look. So that's in some ways how working with plants is that if we kind of understand, we continue to try to look and see, we can actually see a lot of things, and we can also see where we're going with it. So that's the selection process where we're trying to make choices in this moment to perpetuate a variety or germplasm, or however you want to call it, or food. And so it's a very interesting space that I think a lot of us feel really overwhelmed by, and are also sometimes tenuous and cautious, but then we know we have to make choices to clean the seed and put it in a packet and have other people grow it for food. And there's sort of I hope I know what I'm doing in the moment. Which I think that part is where we're trying to reconnect with our traditions and gain awareness, because we want to know what we're doing. We don't want to just be kind of throwing seeds into the future without some awareness. But that's what I think when I say a movement, I don't know what that really means, but I think that's kind of what our movement is doing with seed, is trying to regain and reimagine that awareness for our current context, so that we can become better stewards of food and our community. So that's kind of what I'm seeing. That's my little view into the work that we do, which I think we've talked about way too much probably. But
so let's ground this quantum conversation into what growing seed looks like for you right now. What's going on your farm, in your laboratory, and what do you do with the seed?
Yeah. So right now we have 6 different plots. There's sort of 3 larger. One if there's about 6 acres of land in rotation, and then there's another one that's probably it was an acre or so. Now it's going to be probably 3 acres this coming year. Then there's another acre that's at a different location, and then 2 or 3 small garden plots. I say small garden, 30 by 40, or then there's a larger one that's probably about a quarter acre. So these are spread out over the course of about 20 miles as a crow flies. So across a couple different counties, with my home in St. Albans being kind of the central wheel, or sort of hub, or whatever it is that we kind of depart from. I'm really lucky to work with my mentor, my friend Donna Dyrek, who was for many years Fedco's primary trial grower. So Donna was is an amazing gardener who was contracted to grow most of Fedco's trials. So we didn't have our own trial farm, but we paid Donna to be our sort of grower. And so for many years, for a decade or more, I worked with Donna, and I was the trial kind of manager at Fedco, and that was the interface where I designed the things and evaluated them and co-evaluated them with Donna, and Donna grew them. And just due to sort of unforeseen circumstances, Donna hasn't had access to her property and land, and so she's been working with me the last couple of years, and that's been an amazing. I get to wake up pretty much every day in the growing season and work with my mentor, which is kind of I don't even know what to say about it. Kind of somewhat shocking. So that's been like a huge move forward. And so we're managing about this year, it's about 6 acres of crops. That spread the line between kind of research, sort of breeding works and seed production, some food for ourselves and other folks. And we do that on a couple different soil types. I try to choose plots that don't have rocks, because I grew up with lots of rocks and lots of clay. So I try
Not
to.
one of the traditions you're trying to root yourself in?
That's right. I kind of have like this element of where there's things about farming that I'm not attached to, where I'm perfectly excited to hire large scale tractor work out to really skilled folks in my community who already know how to do that work, who already have that equipment. And while it's a cash outlay to say, hey, for $70 an hour to have someone come over and do something, well, geez, they get it done in like 2 hours, where it would have taken me like 2 days, with lesser equipment or lesser knowledge. So I'm happy. I live in the community that I grew up in. So it doesn't mean I know everybody, but like I know more people, and it helps me have that connection to farmer base of folks, whether it's manure or farmers that I can ask advice of, or just understanding the land and people sharing with me like what they understand about how that piece of property may have been used in the past and the things like that. So um, staying around, which was mostly because of the illness I described. I really had no intention of living in a rural area for the rest of my life, but staying in a rural area and being rooted in that experience has unintentional benefits, which I did not know, and have been really blessed to experience, 48 seasons in pretty much the same location. That might mean that I'm not that adventurous, but the seed work is kind of that adventurous. So we did about 6 acres this year, and that was probably 6 acres, 1 acre too many. What we kind of recognize, that's probably the most we've done, or that I've done. 3 or 4 acres has been kind of more the norm, and we kind of pushed the envelope because it felt like we were getting to an experience level where we could try that. And there was an acre that is excellent soil fertility that I was blessed to be able to use, but it also has a lot of rocks, the thing I talked about trying to avoid. And I kind of didn't know that, and that changed a lot of how that piece of land could be managed. And so the crops that were there were not up to our standards, but they still had value for our seed work. So we were able to kind of get benefit from it. But these are the learning curves of like, oh, okay, actually it's kind of when you crop plan, a lot of times people are like, if everything goes well, this should all work out. And kind of with seed work, it's what I'm learning is when you get to a certain scale, actually, I have to plan, like, imagine if things didn't go well. Would I still have time to get to all the things that are in the field? Because what I learned a few years ago when I started doing too much was there's no point in putting the effort into a crop that you are going to fail, that is going to be a failure. And so I've learned to only do what can actually be, or try to do what can actually be successful, even though that's still a huge amount of like killing myself work. It is a really, like for me, it's both a commitment to the crop, like whatever that variety is or that plant, to say, okay, you're trusting me to do this. I have an obligation to actually fulfill this commitment to you and make sure that this thing that I said that we're going to do and that you agreed to, that I'm not going to fall down on my part if I don't have to, if I don't get sick or there's not some kind of crazy thing. But in some ways, that's what kind of happens is every farming season, you either encounter something in your family or the machinery that breaks down or there's weather or there's something. And that does kind of reframe, I think, for me, the gambler nature of farming and also how that intersects with seed. Like I've always said that farmers are kind of like long-term gamblers, like the worst gambling addicts. It's kind of a joke. But in a way, like it's because it's a very long-term endeavor, particularly with seed. Like seed's a super long-time gambling thing, multiple seasons sometimes, particularly if you're breeding something or sustaining something or stewarding something. And I don't really mean gambling, but really you're playing with a lot of variables. Again, kind of that quantum here, there, now, in the future thought process. What I'm really learning is that it's important to bite off what you can chew, and maybe even less with seed work, because there's a lot of things that come into the stages of seed work. Are kind of, it's not just like market farming where I grew the zucchini and now I'm stuck with a lot of zucchini that I have to sell. Well, it's still the same in seed work. There's still a lot of zucchini that it probably won't become seed, but then I've still got to like figure out when that seed should come out of that zucchini, and I've got to, get the zucchini seed out, and I've got to dry it, and I've got to store it, and I've either got to find a market for it or whatever I'm doing with the seed at the end of that. So the steps are like, in my mind, from my experience with produce farming is way easier than seed in a certain way, because the story ends when either the food goes bad or you sell it. One of the two.
So you've grown on 6 acres of seed, maybe 1 acre too much. I'm really curious what the spacing is on there. Like, do you have wide row spacing? Like, because 6 acres is a lot of crop. Like, I know what you can get out of that. And so, what does spacing look like? And it might be crop dependent, but I'm kind of curious. How much crop is in there in those 6 acres?
Yeah, definitely not what people would assume, because if I was farming just for produce, vegetable production, it would be much closer. We have found that weeds do not have a place in our seed production, because weeds hold moisture. And we live in a temperate climate here in central Maine, zone 4B. And that season is very it's variable. It can start cool, but it also has very hot, humid weather in through July into August. Days in the 90s, nights in the 70s, with high humidity. And we find that for a lot of crops to dry down, I can't space things like I would for market farming, or maybe even how seed producers might in the West Coast or in dry areas on the West Coast. I have to space things quite far apart. So for an example, if I'm growing a bean for seed, I could be spacing those rows 4 feet apart between rows. And if it's a pole bean, it might be quite a bit more than that. There could be a situation where I'm using 2 to 4 times the between row spacing for a crop, because that gives the crop the real optimal growth, but also gives the dry down and the lack of disease and just the management, because there's a lot of stages in a plant's life where we don't use herbicide, and so this is all either hand cultivation or tractor or rototiller. Or in some cases, we do use plastic mulch for peppers, melons, watermelons, and some or most of our winter squash in the particular row. But between the rows, I am making a lot of room. And that does lead to more work for us in our weed control, but it also creates this really great seed drying down. We'll just see it. Like if there's a crop that literally has what might seem to a farmer, like a produce farmer, like a minimal amount of weeds, it will dry down half as slow towards the end of the season, because it's not really about what it's doing in July. It's really about when the days start to get short and the nights get prolonged and the dew is lasting until 11, and then it's starting to cool off at 4, and the dew starts to return. You really only have about 4 hours of drying weather in there. So when I'm drying a longer season crop, like an onion seed crop in the field, which is what we do, meaning it ripens and comes to seed stage in the field, I need every little bit of that moisture, and a minimal amount of weeds at that stage is basically like a huge sponge. So what we see is this element of, that's what's different about the latitudes that we work at and the temperate climate that we work at, is that this there's a lot of places they grow seed where this is not how things roll. I've heard, and that's true. So the distance across, when I do 3 acres of squash, probably a produce farmer could grow the same amount of squash in 1 acre that I grow in 3. So that's probably about sort of extrapolative. And in row spacing also, I like, again, using the bean as an example, I really prefer about a foot between each plant. not the sort of 3 to 6 inches that I might as a produce farmer.
Or even like 2 inches.
Or whatever, people are
Yeah.
doing whatever they're doing. And part of this is selection oriented. There's some projects where we're really like honing in on a specific variety and trying to improve it or select it or maintain it. And that requires some wider spacing to see plant by plant performance or yield or what have you. So there's some of that where we have some projects where our winter squash will go 6 feet apart in a row, single plant seedlings, because we're trying to look at, or our cucumber, because we're trying to reselect or revitalize Marketmore 76 as a cucumber, because there's some off types in a lot of the general strains. And what I've just seen is there's actually some plants that are that are actually disease resistant. So when Marketmore 76 was originally bred, it had these disease resistances, which people are like, oh, those disease resistances are like they're not up to date or something. And then I'm looking at the population, realizing that actually there's still plants in here that are totally disease resistant. They're just mobbed by or watered down by the other gene, sort of filtered through genes of open pollinated production that have kind of come into it or expanded, that are not disease resistant. So this work that we're doing is a little bit outside of just the standard, how much seed can I get off of a row of cucumber? We can do that work, and we have, but we're doing a little bit of a different work where our work is we want to maintain and be able to select the variety as well as get seed off of it. So even in a seed production context, we're not doing standard seed production for a lot of things. It's kind of like, how do we find a spacing that works for optimal seed ripeness, disease management, in a general organic context. We're not certified, but I don't use anything that's not, and I barely spray. I think I spray fungicide like really only for tomatoes and potatoes, once when it's necessary. So for overall, it's a very low spray operation, and we're not using any herbicides or anything like that, and really no pesticides except for on potatoes and say maybe cabbage looper for brassicas. So it's a pretty minimal management, but we find that the health of the crop and the health of the soil and the spacing is the thing that gets us to the promised land. So it's probably like a lot of people come to the field, to the primary field, and are like, where's all the weeds? That's the first thing they ask. And second of all, they usually, thankfully, say how nice our stuff looks. Whether they're being polite or whether they really mean it, I don't know, but thank you. That's what we're striving for. And then they do ask about, why are things so far apart? And we have this conversation about what we're seeing.
Well, thanks for explaining that. And because 6 acres, and it sounds like you're predominantly 2 folks doing the work. That can transfer hard if you think if that might not be clear to somebody who's growing like a 1/4 acre just of salad greens and barely keeping up.
Well, we also aren't doing any marketing. So I mean, what I mean by this is a lot of folks hear that, and it's 2 people working 5 to 7 days a week, 10 to 16 hours a day, which I don't really recommend 16 hours a day, but it's happening. Trying to change that. If you're not being pulled away to wash and pack and go to market with produce, there's a lot of time. So that's kind of a little bit of, again, what's the difference between what I'm doing and maybe what, and this doesn't mean that a farmer can't grow seed. I don't want to give the impression here, because I know that's something that we might want to talk about, is can produce farmers engage in seed work? Totally. Well, I'm doing something different because I already did that produce farming thing, and there's so many produce farming farmers around me that are awesome at what they do. Maine has like the highest density of organic vegetable farms in the United States, pretty much, I think. And they are way better than me and way better capitalized and have way more skill. And I just don't have any interest in chasing that or competing with them, because that's pretty much what it would be. And they would kick my butt. So I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And this other thing is a little bit on that. That's why I kind of say it's more like I say to Donna, Donna, we run a private research station, because it's like it's seed work, but then there's kind of the plus where the kind of contract work that we do get is more someone saying, we have this line or this open pollinated variety that needs cleanup work, And can you do cleanup work on this? Or we have this kind of special pepper or something that's hard to produce. Can you produce that? And more of what we do is that more difficult work or for something that's quirky or needs high attention. And I think like when we in the plant breeding world, we talk about nurseries. Like someone will say, this is my corn nursery or this is my squash nursery. And what they really do mean is it's kind of like taking care of a nursery of children.
Mm-hmm.
And
Your
the
babies that
care
are
that
being
you might
pampered.
give. Yeah, in a way, it's like different level of care than if I was just growing winter squash for seed, which I have done. But we've kind of decided that, well, I'm 48 and I'm not going to be able to do what a 28 or 38-year-old is going to do. I need to kind of use my time doing something maybe it's more suited to my next 10 or 20 years than being a bulk squash producer, for an example, squash seed producer. So it's a little different. So it's true that we grow about 6 acres of crop, and it's probably if I was growing this strictly for bulk, for more like standard seed production, I don't want to use the word bulk, but I could probably do all that work on 2 acres.
Let's take a quick break and hear from our show sponsors. The goal of the Culinary Breeding Network is to improve communication between plant breeders, seed growers, farmers, chefs, produce buyers, and others to improve quality in vegetables, fruits, and grains. The Culinary Breeding Network creates unique opportunities to taste in-development cultivars where everyone can share opinions and be a participant in variety development. Inviting chefs, farmers, and everyday eaters into the breeding process increases public awareness and understanding of organic plant breeding. To learn more about the Culinary Breeding Network and find out about upcoming events, visit www.culinarybreedingnetwork.com and follow on Instagram. Are you a farmer looking for educational resources in Canada? Check out Young Agrarians. They are a farmer-to-farmer educational resource network for new and young ecological, organic, and regenerative farmers. Young Agrarians offers farmer-to-farmer programming, including tools and training around farming, business, mentorships, land access, and so much more. Interested in learning more? Head to youngagrarians.org and give Young Agrarians a follow on social media. All right, back to the show. One of the things that you said you wanted to talk about was how you frame certain concepts or words that we use regularly in the seed community. And you've kind of alluded to a few already in this conversation.
Sure. We'll keep it limited. We'll kind of two things. First is the word open pollinated. I want to kind of approach that for folks when people say, what is an open pollinated? They'll ask, what's a hybrid? But then they're kind of like, well, what does open pollinated mean? And what I want to remind folks is open pollinated is only a word created because a thing called a hybrid was created. So it's a word created in contrast. And if a hybrid had never come to exist, then the contrast of the word open pollinated would never have been formed. So the word open pollinated is not a very good word because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people across a lot of different types of crops. It doesn't really work. It doesn't really mean necessarily that it's bee pollinated necessarily, or that it's not self-pollinated. There's a lot of holes in the word. And the reason is it's a word that's now used to distinguish versus what a hybrid is. So before there was hybrids, there wasn't a word because everything was an open pollinated, whatever we're calling open pollinated. So didn't need to be a word for what it was because it was just vegetables or whatever it was. And then the hybrid thing happened and there needed to be some kind of distinction between. And what we kind of use, the hybrid is also confusing for folks because they this concept of inbred lines and a lot of things around that. But mainly the thing to remind oneself is a hybrid is a controlled cross between, doesn't necessarily have to be two things. It could be more than one thing. But it's a controlled cross. And that controlled cross basically means I am making sure that the pollen from this plant is coming over to this other plant. That's the they very specific. These plants are giving pollen to these other plants, and we're only taking seed off of the plants that are receiving that pollen. And that is whatever outcome that we're defining. And it can be that some hybrids are actually inbred lines. When inbred lines means that they've been kind of restricted through, generational inbreeding, selfing, is what we call it, to express certain genes strongly. And then they cross these two lines and they express those genes that both lines are giving uniformly. And it appears to folks that they say, well, geez, you look at a hybrid and it's uniform. It is uniform phenotypically. Actually, genetically, it's a big old mess. But this is it's not necessarily uniform. It's heterozygous, which basically just means that there's a big old pool of stuff in there. And this sort of, not the miracle, but the way that genetics works is we get certain types of stability from this type of crossing. But mainly the stability is we're also looking for genetic stability with certain diseases. So there's some things in hybrid production. I've kind of gone down that thing. But the open pollinated part this is where it gets really vast and crazy of what's an open pollinated and what does it mean and how should we maintain them. And it's really like so diverse. That's a huge conversation that I would love to have our community have. But that is like people have that biggest question of what's a hybrid, and then they ask what's an open pollinated. And I think that's the biggest response that I try to explain to folks is open pollinated isn't really a word. It's a word created in response to the word hybrid. So it's a huge, vast, almost undefinable context across lots of different species that is really not necessarily to know all the answers about. It's more valuable to know what is a hybrid and try to understand that a little more. So that's one of the places that I think we as a seed community should understand more about what hybrids are and what their potential is in our breeding work, or how we can have that, take some hybrids and use them in our seed work. And also, how do we actually manage open pollinated varieties? Because I do know and also firmly believe that, but I want to put the no part in there. I know that open pollinated varieties can deliver the same value in lots of different ways, flavor, performance, disease resistance, that hybrids can. But that requires stewardship and selection. And that part of seed work is something that we are still kind of, I think, discovering in our seed community what that means. And it means something different for everybody and different crops. So I think a lot of times there's become an assumption that open pollinated varieties are somehow naturally very diverse. Or that's its intended original state. And what we really discover when we go back and say, okay, what did Waltham butternut look like when it was released? It was a completely uniform line. And that was what the breeder intended. They did not intend it to become as diverse and unselected as maybe it has become in different strains of Waltham butternut. So that part of kind of I think we want to be careful to assume that uniformity is not part of open pollinated seeds or varieties. And so there's some of this in our seed community. I think that maybe if you're not part of the seed community, I'm talking on maybe a level that's not very productive. But if you're in the seed community, you probably know what I'm saying. And I think we have some community discussions to be had around what does uniformity mean, and how do we select produce or how do we select seed and varieties, short-term and long-term. And I think recently, there's a lot of conversations around population, but population is really like intrinsic upon like selection and what is your intention, or where are you starting and where are you wanting to go. So there's a lot of nuances in this conversation that I think we as a seed community need to be open to, but also be willing to have, and that there's not one answer. There's a lot of different answers. And I think a lot of us are discovering those in our seed work, because a lot of this stuff is in older books or was in sort of the craft of older seed producers in this, and that knowledge has mostly been lost. So we should not assume
Absolutely.
because there's not information that there isn't something to know.
To summarize what you've been saying about open pollinated varieties is right now there's an assumption that there's a lot of diversity in there, but we can breed and maintain varieties that are actually fairly uniform in the way they appear, the same way we have hybrids that appear very uniform. And these open pollinated might have a broad genetic background, even if they are uniform, the same way a hybrid has a broad genetic background in some context, or there's genetic diversity in it. That it's important for us people working with seed to know that that's possible, and that might not be the direction we want to go, but it is a direction that people can go. And then you alluded to population, so growing enough plants so you can see that diversity expressing. And then we need to choose, and like you talked about, maybe bringing this back practically, you talked about your market more 76. If you're growing them out more spaced, you can see there are individuals that are more disease resistant. If you're working with those plants, you can select something that is more disease resistant. If you're also looking at the fruit, something that's more uniform, and doing this over the years, you can have something that is uniform, even though it's an OP.
And effectively, that's what an inbred line in most cases is somebody has taken Marketmore 76 and maintained it highly, and then crossed it with another line that they've maintained highly. So really, inbred lines are basically, in a lot of ways, inbred lines are a version of an open pollinated line that has been highly maintained. Now, there's sort of levels of the spectrum of that go beyond what you and I might think is even natural or normal. But yes, you've encapsulated that very well. Sorry for talking gobbledygook. But I think basically, like, we throw around words like diversity, we throw around words like open pollinated, and the truth is, in domesticated created crops, there's not actually that much genetic diversity. There's genetic expression or phenotypic, expression that appears to be diverse, and there's a lot of things that we don't understand about plants, or that we've really spent the last 100 years working on mostly single gene expressions in our breeding work and so these are traits like disease resistances or what have you that are mostly about a single gene or a couple genes working together, or at least their markers are single genes, even if that's not the structural mechanism. But most of the things that matter to us, like flavor, are multi-gene expressions. And we don't really know how to manage that. Like, science hasn't really actually figured that out. And that's really cool, because it means that what we realize is, geez, actually, a lot of folks were working without, chromosomal marker awareness and a whole bunch of other stuff, or whatever, genetic, alleles and all these other things that people are concerned about now. But they bred like 99% of what we now consider food without that, which is really important to recognize, that these people that have come before us were probably smarter than us because they didn't have, quote, the tools. There's this sort of like illusion that we're kind of at the apex of humanity. And I'm not saying that some other place was better or worse, but I certainly don't think people were less intelligent. I probably suspect that they were having to use quite a bit more of their senses and awareness, and that intergenerational communication is probably really key to all that, to be able to select these plants to get to, there's a kind of a consistent metaphor with corn, where if you look at corn and you say the genetic selection and then breeding of corn, over the course of the last 10,000 years is like a foot long. And then like the part that we've contributed over the last, 100 years is like your fingernail. So like, we make a big deal about what we're doing now in agriculture, but we're really fighting upstream in a lot of ways, partly because of what we've kind of framed as agriculture. So there's a lot of stuff in this to unpack, and seed work has so many layers and conversations that we're out in the field, and I think we don't consciously think about all these things. But I think there's a bit of this context that travels through us in the community, I think, as we're doing our work. And we all have our theories. Now, I'm going to segue into this other word, the word heirloom. people use the word heirloom vegetables. And I don't really know who came up with this, but I'm going to push back against it. This idea that anything that's older than 50 years old, a variety that's 50 years old, is somehow labeled an heirloom. So, in case folks don't know, there are lots of old varieties that were bred by universities or by seed companies. So you can go back to 1920 or 1930, and there's lots of varieties that a university bred and was released through a seed company. I don't call those heirlooms. Those were commercially bred. It was commercially released. They've either been in the seed trade or consistently or off and on. I call those classics. Okay, so an heirloom to me is very much the same definition as it would be for something that's in your family. It's something that's passed around or handed around in a family or in a community. And it doesn't mean that it couldn't be sold or exchanged or bartered, but it's mostly kind of like outside of the normal seed trade. Okay, we could call a variety that has entered. Well, let me just explain this. So this is my own version of this. Like when somebody gives me an heirloom from their family, I can say an heirloom from Dan's family. If I'm maintaining it and selling it, I have asked this question to myself. Am I selling an heirloom? Because if I went to a place that was selling heirlooms, it would be called an antique. And if I was a museum, it would be called an artifact or something like that. Is it an heirloom if it's been removed from the intergenerational stewardship? So if a seed company is carrying it and it's just being increased by seed growers in seed lot productions, and the seed growers aren't necessarily selecting it, or the company is not selecting it, or we're just selling it in packets. The question I have is, when do we determine that the heirloom status, is it still the same? It's not necessarily the same heirloom that family had. One of my experiences with this was Brandywine tomato, where I continued to hear all these great things about Brandywine tomato, and then I grew 100 plants of it just to be like, what's going on with this? Because I never tasted a good one. And whatever seed lot had occurred with this Brandywine tomato, there was probably 1 out of 100 of those all of that seed lot that was like the Brandywine tomato that I'd been reading about. There were small ones, there was big ones, there was some with no fruit, there was some short plants, there was tall plants. It was pretty obvious that and this is where that kind of diversity thing we were talking about, and people go, oh, well, that's what Brandywine always had. And I'm like, sure as heck didn't. Sure as heck that Brandywine meant that it was somebody went in their backyard and every year selected like the 3 best plants that tasted really good and saved that seed. Aunt so-and-so or uncle so-and-so or grandma or grandpa, blah, blah, blah. And they pretty much had a highly selected line. Might have had some diversity to a certain degree, but I'm sure as heck this wasn't the thing everyone was raving about. So sometimes what's happened is it an heirloom if we haven't given it the care that maybe that community or those individuals would have given it? Like it may have been an heirloom, and the question is it now an heirloom? This is just a question I ask. I don't really have an answer, but in my context for what's an heirloom or not, I sort of generally say, okay, if it's been passed around in a community and it's generally not a commercial variety, or if, then it's kind of has like, it's an heirloom. If it's been sort of bred intentionally by a seed company or a plant breeder and released into the seed trade specifically for packet sales, which is relatively recent, then I call it a classic. Now, a classic variety or an heirloom could also become a traditional variety that's being grown on farms or in gardeners across the U.S. So that they could both be traditional. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a classic is an heirloom when an heirloom is a classic. Now, to convolute this even more, it could be that there's a variety that was released by a university and the home gardener or the farmer just forgot the name and they've been saving it and selling it, or saving it and sharing it. So in some situations, classics have become heirlooms because of the nature of kind of like just our seed saving tradition, where there's a variety that no one really knows what the name of. It probably might be this other thing, but it's been shared and now nobody really knows what the name is, but it might be something from a university, which I think is even more fun. So this is like my pushback against like, like everything that's 50 years older. I'm like, there's hybrids that are 50 years old at this point. Are hybrids heirlooms? All right. So this conversation of like, we market a lot of things predicated upon the conversation of what's an heirloom. Burpee's Buttercup or Burgess Buttercup is not an heirloom. It was bred at a university and then selected by seed companies and has always been pretty much a commercial variety. So these are things to think about. Like, what are the words that we're using? This is my own opinion. I'm very happy. We welcome yours, as they say in these editorials. But these are some thoughts.
Probably ultimately it's a marketing thing, right? Like it's somebody's trying to sell it to you, and that's why it issues those terms. And now there's also varieties called heritage varieties, which are like heirloom. And I don't want to open that door, but I want to kind of bring back that earlier conversation we were having about traditions. And I think a lot of people are looking, with the heirlooms, they're hoping to kind of get back into that tradition that was broken, or that I guess was broken and doesn't exist anymore. And having a name and a story can help ground that. But what I'm hearing also is that there's the actual seed and what it was. It would be nice if that too is part of the reality and that sensorial experience.
I mean, I think our smaller scale seed community is trying really hard to be stewards of traditional or classic or heirloom varieties, even if it's not a family tradition of theirs. It may be, it may not be, or a cultural tradition that they come from. So in general, I think the smaller scale seed producer or seller is probably the better steward for these varieties, even if it's not exactly in the same heirloom context. So it's a question, like, does it mean that that we shouldn't rely upon buying this really special Italian heirloom from a seed company that we appreciate? Do we have to take it on as a home gardener, as a seed saving project to bring it some other elusive value? The answer is no. It's just that that it is kind of a marketing thing, and the cultural context, like you said, is what really, how we embed these things into our community. And I think as seed producers, I think one of my friends had said, like, the seeds are the cheapest part. It's like the packets and the marketing and the shipping and getting it to you and running a website and having a catalog. Those are like at least 2/3 of the cost of the packet. So it's like our social context for how we share seeds creates like kind of a value weight that the seller has to recoup. And in that, we are constantly kind of trying to figure out how many words we can put on a packet and how many words the consumer or the customer is willing to read. Like, do they want to know this lengthy 3-page backstory? Do they care? How do we bring those values to the point of sale? So these things are like, I think these values are generally important to smaller scale seed sellers and maybe even large scale seed sellers. But those are the challenges that we have, where it turns out that kind of cultural context doesn't really fit into the box of capitalist transaction. And that's where we end up with a challenge where, like, this history, this culture, this provenance, this place, these flavors, we are hoping that what we're doing is perpetuating that, or at least giving some foundation for that to blossom. But the actual monetary transaction doesn't really do a good job at transferring that. So I think we're still trying to figure that out.
To continue figuring that out, why don't we have a deep dive into we're talking shop about a couple seed crops? Or when I asked you what you wanted to talk about, you suggested talking about biennials. And I was really excited about that because you're in a climate similar to ours. And actually maybe...
I'm right. I live in Maine. I'm I'm right next to the 45th latitude. Like literally just like up the street, that town is up the street from me, the latitude runs right through it, up the road. So, it's zone 4B, and I can sometimes get frost. My last spring frost could be the end of May. It could be the very beginning of June. There's always variances of how warm or cold a spring could be. And I have had frost as early as the 17th of September, although this year it was more like the 17th of October. So, that's a little variable, but that's what we're dealing with. And that makes it for an interesting adventure with things called biennials.
Why don't we talk about onions? And why don't you tell us how you'd grow onions for seed?
Yeah, well, basically, onions for seed are a lot like growing onions for market. So, seed production really means if you're doing seed production, you really want to be really good at growing the thing that you're growing as if you were a really good market grower. So don't grow onions or any other seed crop for a seed if you're not already good at growing that crop. That's my advice. Get good at growing that crop for food. And the seed part is the plus, but you kind of have to be good at growing that for food before you can really consider growing it for seed. So that's just like the advice to the market grower is if you're good at onions, there's a world for you. If you're not good at growing onions, find another crop. We all have our niches that we're good at. I have no interest in growing lettuce for market. I just don't. And consequently, I'm not such a great lettuce seed grower. I wish I was. So onions are very simple in a certain way is that you're growing it to the food stage.
So you'd plant them at the same time you'd normally plant onions. You want them to bulb up and do all that stuff.
Yeah, transplants. We start things from transplants here in the Northeast, not from direct seed in the garden. So it's all transplants that we start inside and transplant out sometime in the middle of May. We put things out a little later as a seed grower. What I've discovered is I'm not rushing for the market. I've also discovered that a lot of what I see is a lot of market growers are putting their onion transplants out here even in the end of April or very beginning May, kind of irregardless of what the soil temperature is, because folks have a lot of onions and they take up room in their greenhouse and they want to make the transition from onions to, say, tomatoes. And so there's a rush to make space. But the truth is those onion seedlings mostly just sit there. There's no real value in the soil. It's too cold in general for them to uptake any nitrogen or really start their growth cycle. So for a lot of times people's onions, I plant mine about 2 or 3 weeks later than everyone else's. And when they put them in the ground, it's already warm enough for them to get going and actually absorb nutrients. And we all end up with the same size onions. And in fact, to be honest, the onions I put out are often bigger because they didn't sort of lag behind under a stressful condition. So that's one thing I do a little different that I didn't do as a market farmer is I plant my onions seedlings generally towards the middle of May, even the third week of May, which is about 3 or 4 weeks later than most people put onions out. And I'm looking for a seedling that's probably more like a pencil in sort of stem thickness, a little less, a little more. And I am grading my seedlings. Like I'm not going to plant something puny because that actually represents a seed that didn't have good vigor. So a lot of times I'm starting with the seed that's my own seed. And actually by grading my seedlings, I'm actually selecting for the seedlings that have more vigor out of the gene pool. So I'm actually kind of roguing out low vigor population members. So I'm growing the onion through the season, good fertility. Onions are heavy feeders. They love water. They love all the things. And in theory, they're going to get big bulbs and that's happy. And the curing process is the same, bringing them out of the field. Although, here's where we want to sort of segue here. The curing process is part of the selection process for the onion. And for me, it's both onions that are the correct sort of shape. I'm trying to maintain some varieties that have some specific shapes or colors. So that's a point at harvest where I'm like, okay, this is a good shape. This is kind of whatever, and I can give that away or I can eat it or can sell it. The ideal members of the population are the ones that get framed as seed. Now that can be depending on how strong you select. You could select 1/3 of the population for ideal members, or it could be as few as 10%, depending on how hard you select or how scrambled up you're starting with some heirloom or something that hasn't had a lot of special care recently. So that's the point of the selection. And then as I'm curing the onion, and we do onion curing in a really different way, we actually cure the onions outside. We don't use a greenhouse. And that's a little bit different, and it's actually reflective of how onions used to be grown. So some of what we're doing is mirroring some techniques that people were using in the 1800s for varieties that were bred in the 1800s. kind of a wacky concept, but it totally works. Shocking. People are always surprised, and I have photos I can share with Dan of this. When we cut the necks, so this is a selection point. When you cut the neck of the onion, you will see there is either a single stem in that little neck. So it's dried down, it's, flopped, or it's shriveled up. This is like market farmers do this. They cut the long necks off at a certain point, and you cut the neck, and you can see that there's either one growth point coming through that neck, or there's multiple growth points coming through that neck. And that's a point where I can select for single-centered onions. So that means when you cut the onion, there's basically a bullseye ring. Now, if I don't select for that, then I will actually start seeing onions that when I cut them, that they have 2 or 3 centers. So they have kind of 2 or 3 rings that are kind of intersecting with each other. So cutting the necks at this point, when I'm doing that, when I'm trimming it, I just take a look. And the ones that have multiple growth points go into the giveaway pile.
When you're saying cutting the neck, how deep are you, like where in the neck are you cutting?
Just like an inch or something above the bulb shoulder. I'm not cutting into the actual onion itself. So this is after the onion neck has shriveled down or dried down in the curing process. Then you kind of remove this mostly dry neck at that stage. And that's a point right at that moment where, if with a good sharp pair of scissors, I can see that there's more than one growth point in that first year bulb. So it's a point where I can select for single centers. And then what happens is those onions that are the ideal members of that population, which is, like I said, somewhere between, in my case, 30% to 10%, depending on the variety, I store them over winter in a dry, sort of even temperatured, cool place. And nothing special, basically just in crates, in bulb crates, stacked up on top of each other. Multiple layers of onions in the same bin. It is valuable to place the onions in the bin in the upright so that their stems are up, because they may start to sprout in storage depending on the time of year. And if they are upside down and they have this kind of loopy neck thing that comes out, it's not ideal. It's harder to plant them back if you get some sprouting in the spring when they have necks that are going all over the place. So it's good to carefully place them into the crates and stack those crates so that everything's kind of upright. And in the spring, in May, I keep checking them. I rogue out the few that start to go bad, if there are such things, because in general, these are storage onions. And usually at the second half of April, or is when we sort of bring them out of storage and decide who gets planted back. And part of this is some of them may have rotted, some of them may have substantially sprouted, and those get disposed of. And we're looking for an onion that's still really solid, still has, and has good shape as we selected in the fall. Hasn't sprouted severely. Maybe there's a little bit, but not like a huge thing. And then those get basically planted back into the ground at the same depth at which they were harvested, mostly about that same depth. And they throw up a really amazing seed stock over the next 3 months that needs support. So the second year we're using we're using twine. We're using T-posts. We found that, you can probably have a T-post every 10 feet or 8 feet or something like that, but that we're using twine. We originally were using baling twine, but baling twine tends to stretch, doesn't hold these things upright. So you want to hold the onion stalks upright as they grow. Some people use a trellis netting. We tend to use a single row cultivation model rather than kind of a bed model for our onion rows. And we tend to get, let's say, I would say we get about a pound of seed off of a 200-foot row of bulbs.
You're growing them one row per bed when you're gutting the seed, or you have more than one row per bed?
No, it's row culture. It's not really a bed. It's
so
basically
it's a row.
Yeah, so it's a row. We find that that's easier to manage weeds, and a lot of folks will put them into ground fabric, I should say, or greenhouse fabric. There's a lot of ways that people do this so they don't have to cultivate.
How much spacing between the bulbs in the row?
1 foot.
1 foot. Okay.
Yeah. We want a space where we can put a scuffle hoe between. And because, we just find that when we plant them back out, the density of that makes it really hard to hand weed, and particularly if there's like a trellis over them. And the weed control is really needed because we need that seed flower stalk that eventually flowers and produces seed to dry down. And I made the mistake of letting some kind of a plot of onions go feral, basically feral, kind of unweeded, medium unweeded. And they never really dried down, as opposed to one that was very well weeded and trellised and supported, and they all dried down. And it was like crispy, good seed.
So when an onion seed, like the onion flower, starts to get mature seed in it, that you start seeing that dark seed in there. At what point do you harvest your onion seed? Do you harvest them as soon as you see the black seed, or do you really let the whole flower dry down?
It's a good question. It's really variety specific, and I think this is where people kind of get hung up on how do you grow onions. It's like, well, it's kind of how you grow each variety. There is a little bit of like that window of harvest might be different, where a variety may ripen seed quite late, and you might need to take it when half the seed is hard or a quarter of the seed is hard. So onion seed, they create these black seeds in the seed pod, and there's a stage in onion seed production that's called the dough stage, and this is where the seed is black, but you can still squish it between your fingernails. Now, some people say that you can harvest it at that stage and that seed will dry down. That is true, but the seed quality isn't great. And so it's better if you harvest it where it's either mostly hard or almost entirely hard, and bring it out of the field. And then, so we try to get it at like a 2/3 to 3/4 dry. For most of at least half of the seed has reached the stage, and the rest of it is beyond dough stage. And then we bring it in and we actually rack it on racks in the flower heads.
So you're cutting off the stem, the flowering stem?
Yeah, I'm just cutting off the head.
Just the head, not a part of the green.
No, we find that it's just like with garlic. I mean, I grow an acre of seed garlic, and with garlic, I leave the tops in the field. I cure the garlic as the bulbs only, because if you bring in the green stuff, which in this case is the seed stalk from the garlic, you are adding humidity to the room, and you need to dry down the stalk. So basically, if we take just the flower head and 2 inches, whatever it is, easy. You want a little handle, but you don't want like this. In my opinion, that's my experience. And I bring those in and we rack them. We bring them. We actually cut them into leaf bags, the paper leaf bags. We tape the bottoms. Some leaf bags are better than others, but we make sure that the bottoms have been taped, and we cut them into those bags. And usually, you don't have to rack them immediately, but there's still quite a bit of like stickiness, even if you think the seed head is dry. It's amazing what racking it for 2 or 3 days in a good drying room that has like a temperature between 80 and 90 with good fans, how that seed just falls out of the head, and the stickiness that alliums have, this certain stickiness that the seed heads have. And if you're experiencing that, it generally means the seed isn't dry or the seed head isn't dry, because that really can impact extracting the seed out of the seed head, however you're going to do that. So we're trying to get past that stage of tackiness or stickiness. We've found if you take them out of the field and you leave them in the leaf bag, they don't really dry. They need to be out with air on them. Once they're really dry, the extraction process is shockingly easy. But we found that if they're not dry, then the extraction process is shockingly frustrating or not very productive. So that's where we've come to that space where then there's an element of, at a home level, you can, and we pretty much do most of our seed lots in this as simple as we can, where you can take a grading rake, a heavy grading rake, and literally just like beat the heads on a tarp, and they already will have dropped a lot of seed in that screening process. We probably get half of the seed that comes out of the head, or a quarter comes out in that racking process on the screens. So we're scooping that.
Do you keep that separate right away? Like you just put the stuff that's shattered aside because it's a bit easier to clean, or you handle it all together?
Well, I mean, I think once it's fallen out of the head, we're going to keep it separate. But we're going to, put it into like a breathable bag to let it to continue if it needs to, or, let that kind of be considered. It's basically dry at that point, or is dry. And then the seed heads, there's still some stuff in the seed heads. And it's a good question. If the seed hasn't fallen out of the head, you can sort of realize that the seed quality isn't as good as the stuff that fell out of the head. So there's some of this like 80-20 element where like, how much effort do you spend trying to get every onion seed out of the head? Now, Donna and I have a lot of debates about this. Donna kind of believes she has a perspective that every seed is kind of sacred, which I don't disagree with. But at the same time, I know in nature, some of these things just go to feed the world and the animals, and it doesn't become the next population. So to me, you should sort of assume that 20% of that seed is probably not worth capturing. That's my perspective on a lot of this work, is that sometimes folks they spend a lot of time trying to get every seed, when I'm like, you should have stopped halfway. The 50% that dropped right there, that other thing, if you can get back to it, good. But like, you better I would prefer to stick with the stuff that easily fell out. And that includes the sort of crunching process, because you can go ahead and scrub those seeds on a wire screening sort of thing with a grout float. So there's these rubberized grout floats that you can buy at the hardware store and rub the seed heads, and you'll get more seed that will come out. But there's still going to be some seed. And the thing is, there's seed that stays inside the flower that doesn't drop entirely free. So it comes off the plant, but it still is wrapped in this dried flower. And it's almost impossible to get all that out. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that 20% is either A, not worth the trouble, or has low germ. So after we've done this amazing process of some sort of easy and then maybe a secondary extraction with this rubbing or rake process that gets us the most of the seed, then we've been lucky to be taught by Richard Favreau about this floating technique, where we float after they're dry, we float them, which people are like, oh my God, what are you doing making dry seed wet? It works like a charm. So basically float washing the seed, where the heavy seed sinks and the other seed
So you're putting
rises.
in a container with water.
I am, and I'm using warm water. I want to let people know that warm water works so much better for any kind of float washing than cold water, shockingly, because it dissolves the stickiness, whereas cold water tends to not do that. So there's some value in using warm water. I stumbled upon this. Also, your hands don't freeze to death in the fall when you're trying to do this work. So if you can get a warm hose or access to warm water where you're doing your seed work, whatever it is, you'll see some value in that. But this is basically, filling a bucket. You put seed into the 5-gallon bucket, maybe half full, and then I continue to fill it, and I stir it around, and a bunch of seed falls to the bottom of the bucket, and there's this cap of debris, which you could winnow, but we found that it's actually quite difficult to winnow that off, and also that those seeds that are heavy that are wrapped in this dried flower petal, and all of those float. Or at least my experience is most of those float off. Now, the secret is, yes, of course, it's only like a 5-minute process. This isn't like the seed isn't
You're not
sitting in
soaking
this
them.
water.
You're just
Yeah,
putting it in,
I'm just
taking
doing
it off. Yeah.
And then we re-rack them. And that has been the most effective way for us to get high germinating onion seed with a pretty, straightforward process. Of course, we trial and error. None of this was straightforward. Now we feel like, okay, this is what we do. I'm sure there's an even better way to do this, is to use a belt thresher to separate the seeds out of the heads. If you have one, they're amazing. So that's a really valuable tool if you can build one or use one. That's the tool for kind of professional extraction of carrot, beet seed, onion seed, etc. It's a belt that is kind of rubbing in different directions that doesn't damage the seed, but basically strips the seed off of the stem. And in general, there's a whole lot of stem that falls down, and the seed goes out the other direction or falls out, and they get separated in the process, and then there's sort of winnowing involved. But even in that process, I still think this float washing element has a lot of value. Yet, of course, again, like it was a little disheartening because we had all this onion seed and then we float washed it and then we probably lost a third of the seed. But the germ was substantially higher. And the challenge with onion seed is that onion seed is notorious for not holding its germ. And I think this might be because we are keeping around seeds, obviously, that have lower vigor. And if I want a really long-lasting onion seed batch, which is what we've seen, is that we are getting really good germ even 3 years later on some batches, that this high grading is really good. And I would like to have high grade seed. I'd like to feel that that's what the customer is getting if they're encountering a seed lot that I've grown. So that's my own approach, is to try to get kind of a higher grade seed lot. And I do separate the grades. Like I have like 3 grades of seed. I have like my A grade, B grade, C grade. And the B and the C are generally what I sell. And then the A grade is kind of what I hold on to for stock seed and or kind of like sales that might be needed if there's a disaster occurs. The germ is usually sort of, 5 percentage points between each grade. And generally that grade is created by winnowing. And the winnowing is really simple, and it's primarily just 2 box fans on the back of my pickup truck with bins and a tarp. It's not that the Winnow Wizard isn't an awesome thing. I'm just probably too controlling to allow a machine to do the work for me. But I think it's a great idea. I love it, but I'm too controlling of a personality to have faith that it did it right. So I want to see that, and I want to adjust it and play with it and tweak it and kind of see it. So, I'm like that. But that's how onion seed has worked. And I want to frame that people say, can you grow onions in the temperate Northeast or wherever in a temperate climate? You can grow onions, but it isn't necessarily that every onion is suited for our environment. So we definitely are going to say that like there's onions that are going to work and grow good seed and ripen seed, and there's onions that probably won't work. And that might be the class, the type, or they might ripen really long. Like leek seed is quite hard for us. It's like you have to pick that at the end of the season before stuff goes crazy with the weather. And even then, sometimes they're not dry. And we're experimenting with and have found success with trenching the leeks in the fall. So we dig up the leeks, evaluate them, and immediately replant them in a foot-deep trench. And then those overwinter outside, and then they grow seed. And that has been the way that we have started to see that maybe this is where we can produce leek seed consistently. Because it's not about whether you can produce some leek seed. I can produce some leek seed, but can I produce a saleable amount of leek seed? And if I can't really produce this, and not to say it's not worth it on a home garden or seed saving level, but on a kind of a commercial production level, having like 5 out of 50 plants survive the seed production process isn't really worth it. So you have to create a process where you're getting like, okay, these leeks have either survived storage or they've survived in this trench, and 75% of them are going to produce seed to justify that space and that effort. But this trenching element has worked. We took a Lancelot leek, which is an open-pollinated, very consistent variety, and consistently available, so we weren't like throwing anything rare to the wind. And we trenched it last fall. We actually graded it by size of leek to see if the different sizes of leeks would survive in this trench method differently. We intended to backfill the trench, but we were fools, and the ground froze before we were able to do that. And we ended up having to mulch this with pine shavings and or straw. And we were like, this is a total failed experiment. Lo and behold, they sprouted and produced seed in this pretty marginally open, it was very open winter in Maine last year, not a large snowpack, but they survived, and we saw that we could get seed in this manner. So we have a bigger trenching experiment this year with lots of plants, both of brassica as well as leeks. So we experimented with this with brassica, also with kale, because some kale varieties will overwinter for us and some will not. But So segue is lots of things with onions are fun and alliums. We grow a shallot, we grow a couple different onion varieties, and we are trying to grow 2 leek varieties at this moment. The leek varieties are the most challenging, and they have a very long season. So I wouldn't start with those if you live in a short season temperate climate here.
So I'm going to ask you a couple questions, lightning round. So what would you tell your younger seed growing self? What advice would you give younger Heron?
Oh, I don't know if it would be about the seed growing. But yeah, I think I wish I'd started earlier. I think that's, I wish I had, it's always a huge thing is like, geez, if I knew what I knew now when I was 28, then I would be so much further. So, trusting your instincts, trial and error, stick with it. There was a transition in my farm in that space where I was selling produce and working with seed. And that was the right thing. I was lucky to make that transition and also have a day job, which I think is also, it's like that balance, like I explained, where I was working like 2 jobs basically. It was necessary. There's not enough money in my region, I think, either to just be strictly a farmer in some cases, or to be strictly a seed farmer. So I find that most farms traditionally, somebody had an off-farm job, even going back over the last 100 years, whether they cut wood or they drove a bus or they did a bunch of different things. So I think a lot of folks say, oh, I'm trying to make money just farming. And I'm like, that is kind of a rare thing. And I think that if I had kind of like known that balance was the way, I wouldn't have kind of felt like I was a failure because I couldn't make money just farming enough, quote, to survive. So, I think there's a lot of we look at ourselves very self-critical, a lot of failure feelings in farming or in our work because we should be able to make a living. What's wrong with me that I'm not doing this, quote, more efficiently? It must be a failure in my crop planning. And of course, all those things we have growth curves on. But I think it's just important to know farming is often one part of a person's income. And it really does take a lot of capital investment. And oftentimes folks that are successful, maybe they have a generational base of equipment and land that allows them to just farm. But even in that case, I often find those folks are driving a bus or doing something else. So it doesn't mean it shouldn't be a certain way, but it's not a failure to have an off-farm job.
What would you say to market growers to get them to start growing a little bit of seed on their farm?
Yeah, for me, it was really because I thought and discovered that there was these really tasty, unique varieties, and then I couldn't either get the seed for them or consistently get the seed for them. And so it became a niche for my farm to grow specialty produce. And the seed production was the way that I did that that was kind of created that avenue. So that was where it started for me. And I think that's, I don't know, I've heard this story from a lot of farmers where somebody gave them a special tomato. They're like, oh, this is my family's, paste tomato. I just want you to have it. You guys are so nice and grow the seed. And then that becomes something that everybody at the farmers market is looking forward to. I also found that in my breeding work, people were really excited to taste mixed cases of melons. They were like, oh, every one of these is different. And I like that. So so that was kind of interesting to start selling like half cases of breeder mix melons. Or if you have a CSA, to be able to share this diversity and bring people into the selection process for them to taste, tell you which melons they liked and be part of the seed saving or the sort of selection process is really exciting. So there's ways where seed extraction, finding something that really has got a market niche, that whether with your customers in the market, in the farmer's market, or with a chef or what have you, that seems to be a really good gateway to start with, like 1 or 2 really special varieties, and they can end up being like signature varieties for you. And that's how it sort of started on my farm. I actually never really thought I was going to do seed work. The truth is, I actually was wanted to grow nursery stock. I was was interested in having a fruit tree nursery, and this produce thing was going to be the annual income that supported the long-term nursery. But the nursery thing kind of got subsumed in the seed work, and I kind of fully went into the seed work.
Is there anything that I should have asked you that I haven't asked you?
I think you should have asked me, Heron, do you know how to give short answers?
Well, I will know next time we have the conversation.
The shortest answer of this entire interview is that one.
How can people find out more about what you're doing?
I mean, I'm trying to stay relatively low key because I'm not a retailer. I don't sell seeds direct. I'm really happy to share my experiences, and I try to share with everybody whatever it is I've learned, even if it's going to lead you astray. So, emailing you is great. If you see me at a conference or in person, feel free to talk to me. I'd love meeting people. I do have a website. It's not really up to date, but it does have information about how to contact me, and I'll share that with Dan. But I don't really use the website. To be honest, the work that I do is the thing that I do, and so I'm not like an Instagram-y or Facebooky person. I don't have anything against that, but we're just doing what we're doing. So the answer is, I live in Maine. I try to be pretty nosy, and I try to get off the farm enough to poke into other people's business. And I hope that we run into each other. And I would anybody who's interested in seed, really excited to hear from you either by phone or email.
Well, thank you so much, Heron, for this conversation, and I hope you have a fantastic next part of your season. And that's episode 22 of the Seed Farmer Podcast. I've been cleaning marigold seeds lately, and I used to be really frustrated by marigolds, but what I've realized is that I think I was growing the wrong varieties. They just didn't have enough time to mature seed, and I was having a hard time cleaning this partially matured seed. So I trialed a bunch of varieties at Turnasol, and I found that there are quicker maturing varieties, and they produce nice dried seed heads in time for me to harvest them. And once I'm dealing with nice dried seed heads, it's easy enough to extract the seed if you have the right screens and stuff. So that has brought me a lot of joy this week. On the Seed Farmer book, I've received emails from some of you that are having a hard time ordering the book directly from our website at Turnasol to be shipped outside of Canada. So I've been looking into this, and it turns out it's a simpler problem than I thought, and I fixed it. So you can now easily order the Seed Farmer book directly from Turnasol to be shipped pretty much anywhere in the world, definitely in the US and in Europe, probably a lot of other places too. So if you want to order directly from Turnasol, you can now. Please leave a note when you're placing the order if you want me to sign the book for you. Also, do note that we need to charge shipping fees to cover the shipping to you. So you might get better shipping quotes if you're ordering closer to home. If you're in the US, a great option is to order directly from no-till growers. A huge thanks to Heron for being on the podcast. A huge thanks to Sophie Dalton for the theme music. You can hear more of their music at sophiedalton.com. Thank you so much for joining me in these conversations with seed farmers. You can find more seed growing resources on my blog at seedgrowers.farm. While you're there, you can subscribe to my newsletter full of seed growing, crop planning, and farm spreadsheets. You can also pre-order a copy of my upcoming book, The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seed. The Seed Farmer podcast is produced in part by no-till growers with the help of our sponsors. Thank you, Michael, for all the post-production work you're doing and nudging me to be a little bit more succinct. A huge thanks to everyone else at No-Till Growers for making this podcast happen. If you haven't already subscribed to this podcast, now's the time. You wouldn't want to miss the next episode. Until then, happy farming.